This is Francis Gary Powers' U-2 plane, according to the Soviet Union at least. That's what this is, the pile of wreckage from Powers' plane after it crashed in the Soviet Union. And I think Oswald was used by American intelligence in a scheme to make it seem as though the Soviets were able to down this plane. And in this video I'm going to describe why I think that. But first I'm going to have to review the U-2 incident. And I'll do that by reading some Wikipedia. Francis Gary Powers was an American pilot who served as a United States Air Force officer and CIA employee. Powers is best known for his involvement in the 1960 U-2 incident, when he was shot down while flying a secret CIA spying mission over the Soviet Union. Powers survived, but was captured and sentenced to 10 years in a Soviet prison for espionage. He served 21 months of his sentence before being released in a prisoner swap in 1962. After returning to the U.S., he worked at Lockheed as a test pilot for the U-2, and later as a helicopter pilot for Los Angeles news station KNBC. He died in 1977 when the KNBC helicopter he was flying in crashed. And this is the pile of wreckage of the helicopter crash that Francis Gary Powers died in. Reconnaissance mission. The primary mission of the U-2s was to overfly the Soviet Union. Soviet intelligence had been aware of encroaching U-2 flights at least since 1958, if not earlier, but lacked effective countermeasures until 1960. And Oswald defected to the Soviet Union in November of 1959. Or was it October? It was late 1959, I forget exactly. But it was shortly before, a few months before, the Francis Gary Powers flight. So before Oswald defected, the Soviets couldn't shoot down the U-2s, but after he defected, they could. Powers was discharged from the Air Force in 1956 with the rank of captain. He then joined the CIA's U-2 program at the civilian grade of GS-12. U-2 pilots flew espionage missions at altitudes of 70,000 feet, supposedly above the reach of Soviet air defenses. The U-2 is equipped with a state-of-the-art camera designed to take high-resolution photos from the stratosphere over hostile countries, including the Soviet Union. U-2 missions systematically photographed military installations and other important sites. Powers was shot down by an S-75 Dvina surface-launched missile, one of which hit a MiG-19 jet fighter, which was sent to intercept the U-2, but could not reach a high enough altitude. Its pilot, Sergei Safronov, ejected but died of his injuries. Another Soviet aircraft, a newly manufactured Su-9, on a transit flight, also attempted to intercept Powers' U-2. The unarmed Su-9 was directed to ram the U-2, but missed because of the large differences in speed. As Powers flew near Kosolino in the Ural region, 3 S-75 Dvinas were launched at his U-2, with the first one hitting his aircraft. What was left of the plane began spinning, only upside down, the nose pointing upward toward the sky, the tail downward toward the ground. So the story is that Powers' U-2 was taken down by a S-75 Dvina missile. The incident set back talks between Khrushchev and Eisenhower. Eisenhower at this time was on a big peace kick, and he was trying to end the Cold War, he and Khrushchev. But the U-2 incident put a stop to that, and you can imagine, I'm sure, that there were people who didn't want the Cold War to end. People like arms manufacturers, Wall Street, and the CIA. So this would have been very good news for those kind of people. The U-2 incident set back peace talks between Eisenhower and Khrushchev. Eventually, there was a prisoner exchange, which brought Powers back to the USA. The CIA, in particular Chief of CIA Counterintelligence James Angleton, opposed exchanging Powers for Soviet KGB Colonel William Fisher, known as Rudolf Abel, who had been caught by the FBI and tried and jailed for espionage. First, Angleton believed that Powers might have deliberately defected to the Soviet side. CIA documents released in 2010 indicate that U.S. officials did not believe Powers' account of the incident at the time, because it was contradicted by a classified National Security Agency report which alleged that the U-2 had descended from 65,000 to 34,000 feet before changing course and disappearing from radar. The NSA report remains classified as of 2022. So, apparently, before being brought down by the Soviets, the U-2 descended from 65,000 to 34,000 feet. And now I'm going to play some excerpts of L. Fletcher Prouty interviews, which I got off this video on YouTube. Prouty has some credibility problems. He has said things about the Kennedy assassination which have been proven to be not true, not correct. So I don't view this as proof of what I'm saying about Oswald being controlled by the CIA without his knowledge, but it's an explanation, and I think it's probably true. Prouty was an Air Force colonel who worked with the CIA regarding the U-2 program, which was a program that was administered by the Air Force and the CIA. And this is from the notes of that video, a quotation from Prouty's book. I'll read the red boxed area there. The power of the presidency is elusive, and presidents are never sure when they really have it. Momentous acts, presumably carried out with presidential knowledge and approval, can in fact be committed without the president's authorization. In many causes, the presumption of authorization is standard operating procedure for action. But in 1960, when President Eisenhower launched his crusade for peace to bring about a lasting détente with the Soviet Union, one U-2 airplane, one pilot, and the invisible enemy shattered his dream. The invisible enemy he's referring to is probably the CIA. That U-2, flown into the USSR on May 1st, 1960, by Francis Gary Powers, was not on a spy mission as had been alleged. It was launched for the sole purpose of destroying whatever chance there was for peace. It was the weapon of the war lovers, the missile of the industrial complex. Ike learned what other world leaders have learned. It is easier to wage war than to make peace. In war, the enemy is visible, and he is usually on the other side. And the implication here is that in peace, the enemy is invisible and he's on your side, or at least he's in your side, the enemy within. So Prouty thinks that the U-2 flight with Francis Gary Powers on it was intentionally launched without authorization from the top, from the president, in order to sabotage the détente effort being made by Eisenhower and Khrushchev. That's Prouty's position. And now I'll play the clips from the interviews from this video in which Prouty says that he thinks the U-2, this particular U-2, was sabotaged by providing an inadequate amount of hydrogen for the fuel for the flight. And also he says that the camera used in this particular plane was one that was not of a sensitive nature, that they had taken out the camera, the secret camera, and put in an old World War II camera, because the implication being because they knew this plane was going to go down in the Soviet Union, and they didn't want the Soviet Union to get the high-tech camera.
It was a professional flight operation, which the CIA was authorized to use for spying purposes. The secret of the U-2 was the camera. Geez, the camera was so advanced that's the U-2 that went down with Powers on it didn't have the U-2 camera. It had an ordinary old bomber camera.
Oh,
In
really?
other words, somebody ahead of time selectively had taken the Lundahl out and let I even have somewhere the serial number, the one that was on the U-2 that went down, and it wasn't a Lundahl. And
That's another telling.
In other words, they were trying so hard to keep the Lundahl out of the Soviets' hands that.
But they knew that plane was going down.
And see, that's why they built the plane. They knew at Lockheed that nothing the Russians had could reach the altitude of the operating altitude of the airplane. Therefore, it couldn't be brought down. So when the Russians said they did bring it down, the first thing Dulles said to the Fulbright Committee was they couldn't have reached it at its operating altitude. It came down lower, and then they got it. Well, yet his engine wasn't running. His engine had conked out. See, the U-2 had to have special fuel.
Hydrogen?
And the special fuel was combined. The JP fuel, the ordinary fuel we use like in an airline airplane, and hydrogen, raw hydrogen. And the hydrogen tank only had half enough. So when it ran out, the plane came down right halfway on the flight. But this is the way the government would work. It's the U-2 guys, my office, and the cover people, and we all supported each other. So I provided the hydrogen, among other things. It's just like the U-2 affair cost Eisenhower the chance to talk to Khrushchev and probably reach a détente. That's what his goal was. He had been working on Crusade for Peace.
Yeah,
He
right.
went to New Delhi, India. The biggest crowd ever assembled came to see him. And they planned to go to Moscow and have a bigger crowd there.
At that altitude, with the engines of that time, the engine was special built for the U-2, with titanium blades and everything. The fuel has so much trouble burning that if you put a match to it, it wouldn't light. So they learned through experience that you had to put hydrogen through with the fuel. And a trickle of hydrogen would liven the fuel up, and it would continue to burn. It wouldn't start, but it would continue to burn. So if you take off on normal fuel, then you get up to altitude, you begin to let the hydrogen in. It'll continue. But the hydrogen's in a little bottle, like a propane tank or something. When the hydrogen runs out, your engine will run until the first time it has like a little cough, and it'll go out, and you can't restart. Well, his hydrogen ran out over Sverdlovsk, and down he comes, and nothing he can do about it. Well, my program used to provide the hydrogen for the U-2s. I don't know who messed with it out there where it came from, but it was been simple, just to open the tank and run out 50%. The pilot never sees it. They lower him into the plane from a little derrick. He doesn't see what's there. So that's a simple way of bringing it down.
So the idea here is that the CIA sabotaged this U-2 flight in order to sabotage peace talks aimed at ending the Cold War, in order to extend the Cold War and to extend profits for Wall Street and the arms manufacturers. And the CIA is the arm into the government of Wall Street and the arms manufacturers. I'm not saying Prouty said all of that, but that's what I say. And I think Oswald was used by the CIA in this plot. All right, this sets the premise for my idea here, which I can't say I can't prove it, but I think this idea best explains the evidence. That is that the CIA intentionally sabotaged the Francis Gary Powers U-2 flight and actually sent it out without authorization, without proper authorization, in order to sabotage peace, détente between the United States and Soviet Union as it was being pursued by Eisenhower. Now, to review my last video on why I think the CIA, or why I think the CIA did know about Lee Harvey Oswald as a Soviet asset and acquire him as an unknowing asset of U.S. intelligence, I think that Edwin Ekdahl, who married Oswald's mother, recruited Lee Harvey Oswald for his identity for another boy who was being groomed as a Soviet spy. And I think that there's a lot of evidence which implies that conclusion, and that includes the involvement of Fred Korth in the Oswald story and his subsequent rise to become Secretary of the Navy, and also the zoo photo, as I went over, and other things. So if you're interested in that video, you should go watch it. It's a long video with where I drone on for an hour and 24 minutes and 50 seconds. So I presented the evidence that I explained by saying that Oswald was a Soviet asset and that CIA or American intelligence knew about it. And in this video I'm going to present the evidence which I think is best explained by the conclusion that American intelligence used Oswald for their own purposes. And this event involves Private First Class Martin Schrand, a fellow Marine of Lee Harvey Oswald's at the time at Cubi Point, where they both were stationed. Services for PFC Martin E. Schrand, 18, who was shot and killed January 5th while walking guard duty in the Philippine Islands, will be held in the Barir Funeral Home when the body arrives here. The Marines believe the youth was wounded fatally by an accidental discharge from his own weapon. And this is the report of the corporal of the guard. And we have a report from the corporal of the guard because, coincidentally, the sergeant of the guard had been given the night off. The corporal of the guard, Ronald L. Rowe, on or about 1905, 100 hours, January 5th, 1958, Lieutenant Cherry and myself were checking guard posts at the airstrip area. We had checked the crypto watch and were driving around the other side of the hangar to check another sentry when PFC Persons, who was crypto watch at the time, whistled for us. He told us he had heard a shot fired from the area of the vehicles parked on the other side of the airstrip. Immediately, Lieutenant Cherry and I drove over and found Private Schrand laying on the ground, bleeding very badly. Lieutenant Cherry then went and called for an ambulance. I stayed with Private Schrand. I did not see anyone around the area. Schrand was unconscious and did not move. However, he groaned about 2 or 3 times. Some sailors came in the meanwhile and tried to help. The ambulance then arrived and took Private Schrand to the hospital. I then talked to Commander Walbridge of the security force and told him everything I knew. When I examined the weapon Schrand was carrying at the time, it had 1 discharged shell in the chamber. I turned the weapon over to the doctors at the hospital. Now, this is Cubi Point, where this incident occurred. Cubi Point is part of Subic Bay in the Philippines. And Oswald and Schrand were stationed at Cubi Point, which is this airstrip area on the right toward the front. And there's another base in the background, which I will not deal with yet. But Subic Bay has one base, which is in the background here, and Cubi Point, which is the Marine base, in the foreground. And I've marked out something I call the U-2 hangar. Now, I surmise that this is the U-2 hangar. I'll get to the U-2 later. There's some dispute as whether or not there was a U-2 in this hangar, but I'll get to that. And I've marked out areas that I surmise from various sources of evidence in order to set the scene here. One is where Lieutenant Cherry and the corporal of the guard went and inspected the station at the crypto van. Now, I don't know that that's exactly where the crypto van was, but I surmise it was to the right in this photograph from where the hangar was, and I surmise that that's the hangar. We do know there was a hangar there. The dispute is whether or not there was a U-2 in it at the time. But that looks like the hangar in this photograph, so I'm calling that the hangar. Now, Schrand was killed on the other side of the airstrip. So what I've drawn here is Lieutenant Cherry and the corporal of the guard inspected the crypto van, which I represent with the 1, were on their way to the hangar when the shot was fired, and then turned around and crossed the airstrip to go to where Schrand had been shot, or where Schrand had been shot. And so this sets the scene. To me, what this looks like is a possibility that we have the Schrand shooting being a diversion to get the lieutenant and everybody else away from where the U-2 is in the hangar. They never got to the hangar, and so my theory at this point is that somebody is at the hangar who's going to go into the U-2 during the diversion while everybody goes over to tend to Schrand. Now, this is Lieutenant Cherry's report, and I want to use this to go off on a bit of a tangent here. About 1900 hours on the evening of 5 July 1958, the corporal of the guard, Corporal Howe, and I had just finished inspecting the guard, PFC persons, on the crypto van in the Max 1 storage area. Everything was secure, quiet, and well lit, and the sentry was alert. Corporal Rowe and I think I called him Howe over there, Corporal Rowe and I got into the Jeep to inspect further and drive around to the area and consult with the other sentries. We had just driven around the back of the parking area immediately behind the crypto van when the crypto sentry came running over, whistling and shouting words to the effect, "Lieutenant, there was a shot. The sentry across the way shot somebody. Come quickly." All right, the point I'm getting at here is the crypto van. The guard at the crypto van is named as Private First Class Persons. And note that Lee Harvey Oswald's name does not appear here, nor does it appear anywhere regarding this incident. Nowhere in the evidence is it said where Lee Harvey Oswald was at the time that the Schrand shooting occurred. Apparently the Warren Commission could not find that out, even though they were interested in it. Apparently nobody could tell them where Oswald had been at the time. And this is a memo from the Warren Commission. Martin Elmo Schrand's death while on guard duty at the Naval Air Station at Subic Bay. Naval Air Station, I think I called it a Marine station. Philippine Islands must be thoroughly investigated. The FBI reports which we have seen on this matter so far seem to be rather sketchy. Once again, we have not had time to study this incident in detail, and are not able at this time to make any recommendations as to what further inquiry should be made. It may be well, however, that we should eventually try to locate other Marines who were stationed at Subic Bay at the time Schrand was killed, and at least try to find out what those men thought at the time of the incident. They never did that. Even though their attitude toward Oswald will probably be considerably colored by the events of November 22nd, 1963, they might be able to give us some insight into the question of whether or not Oswald was in any way involved in Schrand's death. So obviously the Warren Commission is interested in the question as to whether or not Oswald was involved with Schrand's death, but the evidence indicates that they took no further action to discover whether or not he was, and they did not interview other Marines who were stationed, who were on duty at the time, something they could easily have done with the resources they had available. And so I think this indicates that for some reason it was decided that this would not be pursued. Now they did inquire to the Navy or the Marines as to their paperwork on the incident, and we do have those documents, but we don't have the Warren Commission questioning anybody themselves on this matter. So apparently the Warren Commission really wasn't all that interested in finding out what happened on Cubi Point. And the Warren Commission had a name of the guard at the crypto van, Private First Class Persons. This is someone nobody ever talked to after the assassination. But it seems to me this would be a person to talk to, or people like this, people who were on duty at the time that Schrand was shot, and ask them about Oswald. Was Oswald on duty at the time Schrand was shot? We don't know. But anyway, to get back to my original tangent, I guess I went on a secondary tangent there. We have it named here in Lieutenant Cherry's report. We have the name of the person guarding the crypto van, and that person is Private First Class Persons. And we know that Harold Weisberg had a copy of this document. This, in fact, is Harold Weisberg's copy of the document. That is Lieutenant Cherry's report that names PFC Persons. And Weisberg even underlined the fact that Persons was on the crypto van in the Max Storage 1 area. So one would think that Harold Weisberg would know that PFC Persons was the guard on the crypto van, since we know he has a document that says so, and he's even underlined the pertinent information. Yet in this letter to Bugliosi, Weisberg says that Martin Schrand was guarding the crypto van. The proof is in the court-martial inquest into the suicide of PFC Martin Schrand, if you want it. When I can get someone in here who is to make copies, I'll Xerox the Schrand inquest. So he's got the papers in front. Well, I don't know if they're in front of him at the time he's writing this, but he's got those papers. He killed himself outside the crypto van when he was on guard duty guarding it. He says this about Schrand when Schrand was across the airstrip, and he must know that, or he should know that, if he's not an idiot and he read the document. Oswald worked there and had to have a crypto clearance just to enter it. Now, what Weisberg uses this incident for is to bolster his argument that Oswald had a crypto clearance, whatever that is, and there's no evidence whatsoever of no direct evidence of Oswald doing anything at all at Cubi Point, let alone entering the crypto van. He may have entered the crypto van, I don't know, but there's nobody saying he did. So Weisberg is either an idiot or he's controlled opposition, and we know he wasn't an idiot. So for this reason and other reasons, I think he probably was controlled opposition. And this is from the official military investigation of the Schrand death. The Max 1 guard was operating under verbal appointments at this time, having recently debarked from an LST. There was no guard book or log that this investigation could find. J. It was an established squadron policy that sentries on post carry their weapons with chambers empty, the safety on, and 5 rounds in the cylinder. Under no circumstances were rounds to be injected into the chamber unless the weapon was to be fired or under supervised instruction. In the interest of safety, permission had been extended for some sentries to carry the rounds in their pockets. And Schrand was carrying rounds in his pockets, but he wasn't supposed to have the gun loaded. The weapon at the scene was a Winchester Model 12 riot-type shotgun, number 982244, containing 1 spent round. This weapon does not have a sling and is illustrated in enclosure 8. Under extensive examination by Fred H. Hutchison, or Matheson, or something, Shafford, Tech W2USN, no discrepancy in the weapon was revealed. There was no evidence discovered of criminal activity in this case. There was no evidence discovered of suicide. Opinions. The absence of any evidence of gross negligence or intended self-infliction is, in my opinion, that Private Martin D. Schrand died in the line of duty and not as a result of his own misconduct. So they're saying it wasn't a suicide. Private Schrand, completely familiar with his duties and with the operation of Model 12 riot-type shotgun, and was in sound physical condition. The wound was inflicted by the Winchester Model 12 riot-type shotgun found at the scene. The discharge of the riot gun was not due to malfunction. Attempts to reconstruct the act of the shooting resulted in no opinion being formed as to the manner in which the weapon was fired. So, by process of elimination, it was determined to be an accident. That is, Martin Schrand accidentally shot himself with a shotgun that wasn't even supposed to be loaded. under his left armpit and through out his neck on the other side. So Martin Schrand was shot on Cubi Point, at Cubi Point, on January 5th, 1958, and it was a strange death. A strange death because even though it was ruled an accident, it wasn't explained except as an accident. That he accidentally shot himself with a shotgun, which was not supposed to be loaded, and he shot himself under his left arm and up through his neck. At the time that Martin Schrand was killed, Lee Harvey Oswald was stationed at Cubi Point, and coincidentally, Roscoe White was also stationed in Subic Bay. He wasn't at Cubi Point, but he was at the other base in Subic Bay. So Roscoe White just happened to be in the neighborhood at the time that Martin Schrand was shot. So to illustrate that in this photograph, Roscoe White was over across the bay at the naval base, while Oswald was stationed at the Naval Air Station here on Cubi Point. Both of them were there when Martin Schrand was killed. And as you no doubt recall, Roscoe White happened to be hired by the Dallas police force on October 7th, 1963, a month and a half before the assassination. And Dallas police motorcycle officer Bobby Hargis said that he saw Roscoe White on the grassy knoll just after JFK had been shot.
And they say that he shot the president, and a lot of them said it was Roscoe White. Now, as far as being one of the few people to know that Roscoe White was on the grassy knoll, when you saw him, what was he doing?
Roscoe White was doing like I was doing, looking for someone who was with a shot. He couldn't tell just like I couldn't.
That's right.
Where the shot was coming from.
So Roscoe White joined the Dallas police force and was allegedly seen on the grassy knoll just after JFK was shot. Therefore, I think it's a significant coincidence that he happened to be in Subic Bay at the same time Oswald was, and at the same time that Martin Schrand was shot. That's an impressive coincidence. And in order to be hired by the Dallas police in 1963, Roscoe White had to obtain a hardship discharge from the U.S. Marine Corps. Otherwise, he would have still been in the Marines during the time of the assassination. So I speculate that Roscoe was instructed to seek a hardship discharge from the Marine Corps, and the Marine Corps was instructed to grant it to him by somebody, who knows who, and so that he could be available for the assassination, whatever it is he did during the assassination. And this is a document written by Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry from Roscoe White's personnel file. And in this document it says that Roscoe White's husband, or Roscoe White's wife, not his husband, he did not have a husband, he was the husband. When the Geneva, his wife said that Roscoe first made application for the police job at the Dallas Police Department on December 12th, 1962. He wasn't hired until October 7th, but he first applied on December 12th, 1962. And as I showed before, and show again here, he was discharged from the Marine Corps on December 4th, 1962. So even though he wasn't actually hired until October 7th, 1963, 8 days after he was discharged from the Marine Corps, he applied for a job with the Dallas Police Department, as if he already knew when he was in the Marine Corps what he was going to do afterwards. That is, it's as if he got out of the Marine Corps and immediately tried to get into the Dallas Police Department, as if perhaps someone had told him that that was his next assignment. Who knows who could have told him that. And looking back to 1956 from the same Curry document, The applicant, that is Roscoe White, was employed by Convair Corporation, Fort Worth, Texas, May 8, 1956, and quit for other employment on July 28, 1956. He is eligible for rehire. Above information from Mr. J.M. Lankford, Security Division, Convair. The applicant did not list this employment on his personal history statement. So this is saying that Roscoe White did not list his employment with Convair on his application for the Dallas Police Department, as if he wants to hide that employment. Why would he want to hide employment for working for Convair? If he's eligible for rehire, that must mean that Convair was happy with him. So this seems a little weird to me. It seems like Roscoe doesn't want it on the record that he worked for Convair. And perhaps somebody, who knows who, told him not to make a record of his employment at Convair. Convair, as you recall, was a big defense contractor. And of course, defense contractors have contacts with U.S. intelligence, and that might explain why Roscoe was told, as I speculate, not to document his employment with Convair. And coincidentally, it can be determined from various documents that Lee Harvey Oswald's brother Robert worked for Convair at the same time that Roscoe White was working there during 1956. There is even a suggestion, though it's not a certainty, that Robert Oswald knew Roscoe White while he worked at General Dynamics in Fort Worth, or Corvair in Fort Worth. Corvair is owned by General Dynamics at this time. In Robert Oswald's book, he's talking about a gun that Lee Harvey Oswald had bought, had purchased, and had sold to him. And he says, one of the mechanics at Convair, where I was working, welded an extension on the firing pin for me. We know that Roscoe White, from other sources, we know that he did welding. So perhaps, it's very speculative, of course, but perhaps Robert actually knew Roscoe White while he was working at Convair, which would be quite a coincidence. It's quite a coincidence that he's even working there at the same time as Roscoe White. So these Roscoe White coincidences just keep piling on here. Roscoe White worked at the same place as Oswald's brother, as Lee Harvey Oswald's brother. Roscoe White entered the Marine Corps at about the same time Lee Harvey Oswald did. They were both in Subic Bay at the same time when Martin Schrand was killed, and Roscoe White apparently was on the grassy knoll at the same time that Lee Harvey Oswald apparently was in the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. That's some pretty interesting coincidences there. Now, going back to that Chief Curry letter, it says there that Roscoe White left Convair for other employment, and that he left on July 28, 1956. But the next thing mentioned in his record is his service in the Marine Corps, for which he enlisted on February 19, 1957. And there's no indication anywhere that I'm aware of that Roscoe White held any job for the rest of 1956. And he was in Fort Worth. And there's more. On July 28, 1956, Roscoe White quits Convair, eligible for rehire, and has no job. Well, coincidentally, that's the same month that Marguerite and Lee moved to Fort Worth. I have Robert listed there too. Robert was already living in Fort Worth, but had gone back to Louisiana and come back with Marguerite and Lee, which kind of makes the story complicated for some reason. But anyway, the same month that Roscoe quits working for Convair for other employment, but apparently has no other employment, that's the same month that Lee Harvey Oswald moved to Fort Worth, and he apparently had no employment either. So during the summer of 1956, both Roscoe and Oswald are in Fort Worth, and both are unemployed. And I think that perhaps somebody, who knows who, instructed Roscoe to make Lee Harvey Oswald's acquaintance and become friends with him so that they could be used together later in some operation, I think on Cubi Point. And here I have it noted that Oswald joined the Marine Corps on October 24th, 1956, and Roscoe joined the following February. All of this is very interesting coincidence, in my opinion. And now I'll get on to the question of whether or not there was a U-2 in the hangar at Cubi Point when Martin Schrand was shot. The only source we have on this really is a Sergeant Daniel Patrick Powers, who was a Marine Corps sergeant who was often stationed with Oswald in various places at various times. And this is the earliest word we have on it, on the record, an FBI teletype. And this excerpt comes from the teletype. After arrival at Atsugi, Powers played football while rest of squad, including Oswald, went to Philippines on maneuvers. In January 58, Powers rejoined squadron, which included Oswald, at Cubi Point, and it was here, according to Powers' recollection, that Martin E. Shroud, and he obviously means Martin E. Schrand, was shot and killed while on guard duty. Powers knows nothing of this personally, but advised that rumors indicated Schrand shot through left side of chest, bullet going through body and emerging right side. And that is correct. Powers advises guards were given pump shotgun and 3 slugs. Chamber of gun to be empty until needed. He also recalls squadron kept there guarding an airplane hangar, which housed a plane that he later learned was a U-2. He does not know if Schrand was on guard duty at this plane. So this is pretty clear, pretty unambiguous, that Powers says they were guarding a plane, and that he later learned that it was a U-2. But when he talked to the Warren Commission, he changed his story. And here Albert Jenner, obviously aware of the U-2 issue, brings it up in the questioning. Do you recall anything in this connection with respect to guard duty relating to some kind of a special airplane? Yes, this happened again, I think after the rest of the squadron left to go back to Japanese mainland, and some of us were assigned temporary duty at Cubi Point there. I believe there were 2 of us, or 3 of us, from the squadron. Who were they? Murphy, I believe, was one of them, and Private First Class Murphy, and I don't recall the other individuals, who the other individuals were, but anyway, we were assigned there, and at this particular time, they were closely guarding a hangar. As it developed, this was, not knowing then what it was a U-2 aircraft, but this was after the rest of the squadron left, which Oswald was included in, for the mainland. Oswald was included in the group that had returned to the mainland? Yes, sir. Was Oswald still at Cubi Point when Marine Schrand was shot? I believe he was, yes. The whole squadron was there then, so he must have been there, yes. But Schrand's guard duty was not guard duty in connection with these special airplanes of which you now speak? Well, no, I don't believe so. I can't say that for sure, what it was regarding, but I don't think so. I think they were on the site guarding the equipment that they had there, and it seems to me that the Air Force moved in that particular hangar after the squadron went up. I think this is correct. So here it's very equivocal. He's not sure what the facts are, but what he's saying is that the U-2, what he now knows to be the U-2, arrived after Oswald had left. I think this was an engineered change of the story, and I think one reason to think that I'm right is that the Warren Commission never asked the Air Force or the CIA whether they had an airplane there. They depended upon Sergeant Powers to give this very equivocal answer to prove, supposedly, that the U-2 arrived after Oswald had left. So I think this is this is bullshit that was created by the Warren Commission, and who knows on the Warren Commission may have initiated this strategy in order to change the story so that we don't think that what happened at Cubi Point had anything to do with the U-2. So, of course, I think the Martin Schrand murder was all about the U-2. And another reason I think so is this document here, written by Richard Helms, who would become eventually the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Here, item 6 from that document, he says, the following should be considered with respect to your source's assertion that Oswald's squadron was in Cubi Point, Philippine Islands in January 1958, where it kept its gear in what the source now knows, he's obviously referring to Powers, to have been a hangar for a U-2 airplane, and that the squadron was back in Atsugi, Japan in May 1958. The term U-2 was not known publicly and did not gain worldwide notoriety until the ill-fated Powers mission some 2 years later. Therefore, it is highly unlikely that the term U-2 would have meant anything to Oswald, even if he had heard that it had been able to identify the term with any aircraft at Cubi Point, at Atsugi, or anywhere else. So here, to deny the possibility that Oswald had anything to do with the U-2 at Cubi Point, he evades the point by saying that Oswald wouldn't have known it was called a U-2. Probably. He doesn't even deal with the issue of whether there was a U-2 there. In fact, the way he talks about it, it sounds like he's admitting it was there, but Oswald wouldn't have known it was anything special. So if Richard Helms is being so intentionally opaque about this, I think that means the U-2 was there when Schrand was killed. So I think that Roscoe White was working for the CIA and probably had convinced Oswald that he was actually a Soviet asset, and that Oswald, thinking that he was stealing information for the Soviet Union, participated in this operation. And I think what happened was that probably Roscoe White incapacitated Martin Schrand silently somehow, and then at the proper time, when the lieutenant and the corporal of the guard were on their way to inspect the hangar where the U-2 was, being guarded by Oswald, I think, even though that's not in the evidence who was guarding the U-2 hangar, shot Schrand in order to divert the lieutenant and the corporal of the guard and everybody else to the site across the runway where Schrand was shot. And I don't have the photo here, maybe I'll put one up, but there is an area where someone could potentially have run after shooting Schrand to get away, a wooded area, and might have evaded observation or capture. And I think during the diversion, while everyone was going over to Schrand, Oswald went into the U-2 hangar and grabbed some kind of U-2 secrets. Now, since this was a CIA-controlled operation, according to my theory, the secrets that Oswald grabbed, whatever they were, probably weren't real secrets. I think the plan here was a CIA plan to have the U-2 go down in the Soviet Union to kill the peace talks that Eisenhower was pursuing in order to keep the Cold War going hot so that everybody could have power and money in the CIA and the military-industrial complex. And but they didn't want to give the Soviets real secrets. So I think what they did was that they made Oswald think that he stole the secrets, and then when he defected to the Soviet Union, he provided those secrets, and then the CIA sabotaged the plane by giving it insufficient amount of hydrogen gas to make it all the way over the Soviet Union. But the information provided by Oswald allowed the Soviets to think that they used that information to bring the plane down. and it would have been important to the CIA to not give the Soviets actual U-2 secrets, but to make them think that they had, so that they could bring this particular plane down and not realize that it was a CIA plot all along to have the plane come down. So I think that's what happened here. I think that's how Oswald was used. I think his original purpose as a Soviet asset was simply to provide an identity to another Soviet asset, but that Oswald wanted to do stuff himself. And I think the CIA exploited that, and that Oswald probably wasn't really too smart, and that he didn't realize how he was being used here. But I think the Soviets realized eventually that he wasn't so smart, and they probably concluded he just got lucky here, and so they sent him back to the U.S. That's what I think best explains the evidence.